All right, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for joining us. I'm pleased to be here today with Minister of Environment and Protected Areas, Rebecca Schulz, Minister of Energy and Minerals, Brian Jean, and Minister of Affordability and Utilities, Nathan Neudorf, to address the federal government's proposed framework to cap oil and gas emissions and stifle Canada's economy. Once again, Ottawa is attempting to set policies that are short-sighted and reckless. This fall, the federal government plans to table regulations that would set mandatory targets with irresponsible timeframes for upstream oil and gas and liquefied natural gas facilities. Ottawa says they're working to cut emissions, but we all know that's what they're really doing is cutting production of oil and gas. And this, by extension, will cut jobs and revenues across the country. And that should concern every Canadian. Alberta's oil and gas industry is a huge part of Canada's economy. It provides a stable energy supply for Canadians and also for people who live in countries and import our oil and gas products. It provides Canadian families with tens of thousands of direct and indirect jobs, as well as billions of dollars in federal revenues that pay for important programs, services, and infrastructure that Canadians rely on. All of this will be jeopardized and lost if this ideological, irresponsible, and frankly, terrible policy moves forward. The federal Liberals seem uncomfortable, or seem quite comfortable with all of this, but I can tell you Alberta is not comfortable with it, and neither are other Canadians. We've heard from business leaders, from industry experts, and many others from across Canada who have raised concerns about the cost of this dangerous cap. We've heard from independent experts from 3 separate firms who have analyzed the proposed framework. And they've told us that this plan will have dire consequences for our country. Alberta's government has challenged past policies like those in the Overreaching Impact Assessment Act. In 2023, the Supreme Court of Canada agreed that the act was unconstitutional and would harm Alberta's energy sector and damage our economy. This time, we're challenging a proposed emissions cap that would not only be devastating for Alberta, but for everyone from Newfoundland and Saskatchewan to British Columbia. We're challenging this proposed policy that would stifle our energy industry, it would kill jobs, and it would ruin economies. And we're doing that by launching a national campaign that tells Ottawa to scrap the cap. We're telling the federal government to forget this reckless and extreme idea and get behind Alberta's leadership by investing in real solutions that cut emissions and do not cut Canada's prosperity. We know that we can reduce emissions and enjoy a thriving economy, but only if Ottawa abandons the proposed oil and gas emissions cap for good. The simple and undisputed fact is this: Alberta is already a global leader in responsible energy production and emissions reduction. And our energy industry is leading the way when it comes to developing technologies that reduce emissions and the size of our environmental footprint. And this includes investing in technologies such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which will position us as a leader in clean tech and help industries cut emissions while also growing the economy. Engineering and innovation will help solve the emissions challenge. Instead, the federal government plans to use a sledgehammer to kill a fly. And today, all I'm asking is for Canadians to join us, to write their MPs, to raise their voices, and to tell them that enough is enough, to scrap the cap. Our future and the future of all Canadians depend on it. Thank you, and I'll now turn it over to the Minister of Environment and Protected Areas, Rebecca Schulz.
Well, thank you, Premier. We are here today to stand up for Albertans and all Canadians as Federal Environment Minister Steven Guilbeault and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recklessly move forward on plans to shut down oil and gas production with an unconstitutional energy production cap. Left-wing politicians and activists refuse to listen to the very real concerns raised by provinces, businesses, and Canadians time and time again. So today, we are once again amplifying these concerns across Canada. We will not stand by while the federal government threatens tens of thousands of jobs while flushing billions in revenue down the drain. It's time to tell the feds to scrap the cap. Enough is enough. This production cap will kill tens of thousands of jobs and will lead our province and country into economic and societal decline. It means risking reliable, secure, affordable energy for Canada, and it will make every aspect of our lives less affordable as it craters our economy. We will not let our country's economic future be guided by an out-of-touch Liberal government whose expiry date is long past due. There is a way to reduce emissions without killing the economy or forcing Canadians into a lower standard of living. But this unconstitutional and dangerous production cap, it's not it. Let's look at the facts. Our oil and gas sector is already leading the way on emissions reductions across our country. Emissions intensity per barrel has already fallen by 23%, and we can double that in the next few years. Our methane emissions reduction target of 45% was hit 3 years ahead of schedule. Without a cap, forecasts are already expecting the oil and gas sector's emissions to further decline in the coming years. And of course, as Premier mentioned, technologies like CCUS will let us produce more low-carbon energy than anywhere else. We are making progress as fast as technology and infrastructure allow, and we will keep moving ahead as long as Ottawa doesn't scare away investments through wacko policies like this cap. The federal government knows this, just like Stephen Guilbeault knows that capping our production does not lower global emissions. It simply increases how much coal and other higher polluting energy is consumed from less clean jurisdictions around the world. Now, the Prime Minister loves to talk about the environment, but his own government has missed every single emissions target that they have set in the last 9 years. Not only that, they have not been upfront about how much this cap will cost our country. Ottawa's proposed cap will cripple Canada. It will cut production, wipe out jobs, and hurt economies from coast to coast. Ordinary Canadians and working families will be forced to pick up the tab. 3 independent reports from reputable firms have validated Alberta's concerns with this very cap, and the numbers are staggering. 1 million barrels cut every day, according to S&P, $28 billion a year in lost GDP, according to Deloitte, and up to 150,000 lost jobs, according to the Conference Board of Canada. And who's going to pay for this? Canadians, Albertans, and our economy. Make no mistake, this cap will hit Alberta the hardest. It will devastate our economy, but we're not alone. More than 450,000 jobs are directly and indirectly tied to the energy sector across Canada. It means lost jobs in Ontario, Quebec, Saskatchewan, the Maritimes, right across our country. But it's not about GDP. It's about women and men, working parents and families, who are going to be unable to afford their mortgages and pay their bills. That, and Canadians will face higher energy costs on top of the affordability crisis that this federal government has already created. Global emissions will keep rising, but governments will have less revenue to pay for hospitals, roads, schools, and other essential services. Ottawa is not being honest with Canadians about the costs and trade-offs here. They repeat their talking points and have failed to give the facts. That is what this campaign is all about, having an honest conversation about the risks and the path forward. And again, here in Alberta, we're proud of our record. Methane emissions are down, electricity emissions are down, overall emissions continue to decline, and we will continue to steward our environment for generations to come, while supporting jobs and workers, while supporting the Canadian energy industry, while fighting to uphold the Constitution of our country and standing up for everyday Canadians and their families. And on this count, I have to thank our Premier Danielle Smith for her leadership on that front. We are sending a clear message to Ottawa that we won't be ignored. We will fight for our future. And I would say, based on what we've seen with Bill C-69 and plastics, I do believe we will win. So just as with the carbon tax and the clean electricity regulations, we are asking Canadians to go online, to write their MPs, to tell the feds once and for all that it is time to scrap the cap. With that, I'll hand it on over to Minister Jean.
Good afternoon. I'm here today to add my voice to those of the Premier and Minister Schulz and the rest of our government on the important issue that we face. As Premier Smith said, we need your help. We need the people of Alberta's help, the people of Canada's help. Not only is the federal government proposal on emissions cap harmful for Alberta, but it risks energy security for our entire country, and for what? Alberta has been reducing our emissions for years, and we didn't need a federally regulated emission cap to do so. This proposed cap will lower quality of life for all Albertans and for all Canadians, and put thousands of jobs and a stable energy supply at risk. We've said it before, and we'll say it again. Alberta is cutting emissions, not production. Cutting production cuts jobs. It cuts revenues. How much of a hit would that be? Well, as of August of this year, Alberta's upstream energy sector employed about 148,000 people. If the federal government goes ahead with the proposed cap, in just 6 years, we could see almost all of those jobs disappear. Why should Canada stand on the sidelines of this incredible industry and opportunity when we are one of the most responsible, if not the most responsible, producer in the world? We know energy demand will continue to rise, and I'm so proud to say that Alberta's per barrel emission are in decline, even as our production has increased. This demonstrates what we already know, that our approach is working. We believe the key to reducing emissions is developing and deploying clean technology, and this is exactly what we've been doing successfully. We are seeing major interest in investments in the hydrogen sector, the nuclear sector, geothermal, carbon capture, utilization and storage, and other innovative technologies right here in Alberta as the leader. Programs like the Alberta Carbon Capture Incentive Program are ensuring industries, including oil and gas and other high-emitting industries, remain sustainable for decades and continue to contribute to the province's prosperity. We are already a global leader in responsible energy development, and we intend to be so in the coming generations. So there is no reason for the federal government to propose an oil and gas emissions cap that will very negatively impact the entire country. Not to mention billions lost in federal and provincial revenues. These pay for programs and services and hospitals and schools that Canadians rely on each and every day. This is just the latest attack by an out-of-touch government and the eco-activists in Ottawa on our oil and gas. The Investment Assessment Act, also known, of course, as the Build No Pipelines Act, has devastated our economy. It also threatens to kill any future infrastructure. Any development in that sector will stop or slow down. They doubled down on just a week ago, thumbing their nose at this country's highest courts. I would think they'd be tired of that by now. They've had 2 defeats, and this is certainly going to be a third. This action by them will kill investment and jobs at a time when we have an opportunity to be a solution to global energy security and energy poverty. They have also pushed through their greenwashing bill that has thrown a gag order on oil and gas companies about the important work that they're actually doing to lower emissions. This will also have a chilling effect on future investments in green technology. And let's not forget about the carbon tax, which has made life so much more expensive for everyone and has not lowered emissions one bit. It's all virtue signaling, and it's all incredibly damaging to one of the biggest economic drivers in Canada. It's time to scrap the cap. Once again, we urge all Canadians, all Albertans, to oppose the federal government's proposed cap on oil and gas emissions and stand up. Visit scrapthetax.ca to join us as we challenge policy that would stifle our energy industry, kill jobs, ruin economies, and hurt Canadians. This is just the beginning of the fight. And for the sake of not just our province, but the rest of Canada, we hope that you'll join us in putting an end to this continued federal overreach, demanding that Ottawa scrap the cap and help Canadians, not hurt them. Thank you.
Thanks, Minister. We'll now take some questions from the media. Just a reminder, it'll be 1 question, 1 follow-up. Please state your name and outlet for the record. We'll start here in the room, and then we'll go to the phones.
Hey, Tim Brooke with CTV. This is for the Premier. Ottawa is capping emissions. It's not capping energy production. So what metric is used to fact-check some of the claims in this ad campaign?
Well, look, I mean, they are calling it an emissions cap, but when you have an emissions cap that has an unrealistic over a period where we do not have the technology to achieve it, the only conclusion and the only way to achieve it is through shutting in production. And it's not just us saying that. S&P Global did a report last May where they were the ones who determined that if you were to meet the federal government's timelines by 2030, it would shut in 1 million barrels a day of production, and by 2035, it would shut in 2.1 million barrels a day. So it's the independent analysis that we're seeing not only from S&P Global, but also Deloitte and also Conference Board of Canada, that we've included helpful links at the bottom of each press release if you want to have a look at those.
Okay, my follow-up, you guys launched, I want to say October of last year, a very similar campaign about emissions. How are we measuring effectiveness of this ad campaign? Obviously, you know, you think to some extent the last one worked, or else you wouldn't be doing it again. So how do we say this is effective? You know, how is that all measured?
Well, I can tell you what I observed with the campaign we launched last year, and it was against the net zero power grid by 2035. Also asserting our constitutional jurisdiction over electricity. And the Electricity Advisory Committee that advises the federal government agreed with us. They said that you can pursue your aggressive target in those jurisdictions that are not reliant on oil and gas, but in Alberta and I believe Saskatchewan, you have to work with them on a more reasonable target. We've said 2050 is what we've heard from our industry as being a reasonable target for us to try to achieve by in the electricity sector. And I think that we got that external validation. And so we've already had the external validation by these three different analysts, and we're just hoping that other provinces will lend their voices to say the same thing. We're in a very dangerous time with COP29 coming up in Baku. You may recall last year was when Stephen Guilbeault decided to announce without consulting anybody that he was going to pursue this. We're very worried that he's going to do the same thing. So we want to be proactive in making sure that they change course, because this would be devastating for the country.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Jordan with CTV as well, and just to clarify, I didn't see a cost in there. I saw, though, that print TV and social media ads, including, I'm assuming, the print ad that was put out east today. Yep. How much is this campaign going to cost? The campaign
is $7 million. It's going to include TV, online video, print, and social media. It'll be in Alberta, BC, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia until the end of November.
And for the Premier, question on a separate topic. Clarity about a question that you answered last week about homeopathic treatments and homeopathy, and something that your health minister said earlier this morning, that the Alberta government is considering and having discussions about whether the government should cover some of those treatments here in the province. Can you just clarify your stance on what the province should cover when it comes to homeopathy and homeopathic treatments, and why Alberta would consider and have those discussions about what coverage could be provided?
Well, I think I mentioned I use laser treatment and physiotherapy as an example of using alternative types of care that are covered normally by private insurance plans. And it's up to Minister LaGrange to do a full assessment of what our system covers, look at what other jurisdictions cover. We want to be able to make sure that we're covering the same levels of care that are happening in other provinces. So that work is ongoing, doing that assessment.
Rick Bell, Post Media.
Hey.
First question, and then I'll have a supplementary. The first question is, through the entire time you've been Premier, you've always told us, oh, there's always hope. There's Mr. Champagne, and he's a nice guy, and Mr. Wilkinson, and he's a nice guy. We can work with him. We can work with him. And in the end, we always come back to this. Always. We have the same comments from you, from your other ministers. Have you finally given up on the Trudeau government?
Well, look, I have to work with whoever happens to be in Ottawa at the time. I think I look at the polls as anyone else does. They don't have a mandate to move forward on these kinds of aggressive policies. They don't even have a dance partner anymore who's willing to support them. And so I would say that taking this kind of approach, which would impact a sector of our economy that is responsible for over $200 billion worth of national GDP, having the kind of extraordinary impacts that we're talking about in job losses, loss of GDP, loss of tax revenue, they simply don't have a mandate to do it. So we're just reminding them and asking the other premiers to also be vocal, especially since there are other jurisdictions that would be equally impacted by this kind of emissions cap, because as we've seen from some of the reports that I mentioned, it really is a production cap for them to be moving along this fast.
And the supplementary is, what has the perhaps future Prime Minister of Canada, the Conservative leader, what in discussions you've had with him and other leading federal Conservatives, what have they told you about all of these things? Minister Jean was mentioning many of the sins of the Trudeau government. Have you talked to them about the No More pipelines, about the clean electricity grid timelines, about this? And what has he or his people told you about what will happen if he becomes Prime Minister of Canada and the Conservatives become the government?
Well, look, I mean, the Conservatives for a long time have been talking about the solution on emissions as being not only export of cleaner fuels to displace international emissions and get credit for it. They've been talking about that for at least a couple of election cycles, but also technology and innovation. And I think part of the reason they see that is because of the work that we're doing in Alberta. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage has already stored 14 million tons of CO2 emissions in Alberta, 40 million tons in Saskatchewan. And then all the work that is happening through Minister Schulz's department with Emissions Reduction Alberta and our industrial pricing program, we've been able to spend $1.5 billion on a whole variety of different innovations, whether it's for carbon capture, whether it's for bitumen beyond combustion, whether it's for hydrogen, whether it's examining small modular nuclear, whether it's geothermal. So I would say that we find that we're very much in sync with the Conservatives on having a reasonable time frame so that you can allow technology and innovation to address the issue, but also exporting our clean LNG to displace international fuels of coal, wood, dung, which are higher emitting, so that we can also truly achieve global emissions reduction.
So will they get rid of all of these nasty policies?
I mean, we'd certainly advocate for that. I think if we can talk about a long enough time frame, and we can talk about exporting so that we can improve emissions performance around the world, as well as also using technology. I mean, one of the stats that we've looked at is that if we were able to displace China's coal plants, even just 20% of China's coal plants, and get credit for it, that would offset all of Canada's emissions. That gives you some idea of just how much our cleaner fuels would be able to help with the global emissions reduction.
Great. Thanks, Premier. We're now going to go to the phones. Operator, please put through the first caller.
Your next question comes from the line of Kelly Kreiderman with the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead.
Hi there, Premier. Just following on Rick's question, you talk about the current government in Ottawa not having a mandate and what Pierre Poilievre might do. Why do this now when this policy could wither on the vine on its own anyways?
Well, because I think that these last few months of a dying government are when they're the most dangerous. This is when I would anticipate that if they don't see a pathway to re-election by being reasonable and working collaboratively, that they're going to pass all kinds of policy, knowing that it would be complicated and take some time to undo it and send a chill in the investment community. The COP 2029 in Baku is taking place within the next month, and that's when we have to be the most worried that the federal government is going to be preening on the international stage and trying to win favor with a certain environmental set, and that they're going to try to brag about what they can do back in Canada. And the fact of the matter is they don't have the ability to determine how we manage our resources. It is under the Constitution, it is our responsibility to determine the pace of our production. So that's the reason why we would do it now, is I think that there's a real danger that we're going to see some ridiculous policies announced in Baku in the coming weeks.
Kelly, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. And just, I've heard your minister speak, and I've looked at the ads you've just released, which seem to focus on groceries. I haven't heard anybody mention anything about how this cap could actually affect groceries or studies to that effect. And I also wonder about the gap here. Why doesn't Alberta have its own plan for reducing emissions that include targets, that include some specifics on what Minister Schulz referenced in terms of the reductions that the province and that the sector will be able to accomplish in the next 5, 10, 20 years?
Well, here's the connection. We looked at the Conference Board of Canada paper, and again, it's in the press release if you want to click through on it, where it says that it would result in 150,000 Canadians losing their jobs and the average Canadian family being left with $419 less per month to spend. And as we know, families who are at the lower end of the income scale, they have to spend a larger share of their income on the necessities of life. So $419 less per month to spend on groceries, housing, and fuel. That's what the connection is. I know that the federal government like to pretend that these kinds of costs can simply be absorbed by industry, but that's just not the case. If you make a product less available and increase the prices, it's going to increase the cost of everything, and it's going to make those dollars not stretch as far. So that's the reason why we're making that connection, if you want to look at that report. And we did our own emissions reduction and energy development plan. That's where we charted out a pathway for how we would be able to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. And the reason why we don't have sector targets is that this is a very individual pathway for each of the different companies. We've got some companies that are going to come on stream net zero, like Dow Chemical and their net zero petrochemical project, like Air Products and their net zero hydrogen project. If Heidelberg gets to the finish line on their net zero cement project, those ones will all be on stream at net zero. And so what will happen is that as we have capital turnover in each of the industries, they will use best available technology, and that takes time. You don't want stranded assets. So that's why we want to give enough runway so that we can develop the best technologies and then give each company the opportunity to be able to invest in a time frame that's reasonable. Looking at pathways as an example, they've set a 2050 target because they're waiting for certain technology to become available. They want to do carbon capture for a portion, but they also are looking at small modular nuclear rolling out. We have the very first small modular plant coming on stream, I believe, in 2026 in Darlington. You may have to talk to Premier Ford about the time frame on that. All the premiers, incidentally, are going to be visiting that when we meet in December for the COF meeting. I think we're all pretty excited about that. But I think because we have never developed nuclear in this province before, that's going to take a longer period of time to be able to roll that out, probably no earlier than 2035. And then on top of that, direct air capture is probably the last piece. And we just have a company that is investing $50 million in a direct air capture test facility in Innisfail so that they can look at all of the different potential avenues that would be. This stuff just takes time. And we want to create a nurturing environment so all of those technologies can be invested in.
Operator, next caller, please.
Do you want to say more on that?
Your next question comes from the line of Jonathan Bradley with Western Standard. Please go ahead.
Hello, Premier Smith. Thank you for taking my question. So you spoke about this campaign being rolled out now to try to encourage the Canadian government to change its plans with the oil and gas emissions cap. What was the process like for creating this campaign?
Let me put it over to Minister Schulz because she was very heavily involved in that.
Sure. This campaign really was following up on the initial Tell the Feds campaign, which was raising awareness amongst Canadians about the clean electricity regulations and the implication that that would have for affordability and reliability of electricity in Canada. Essentially, that was successful. I mean, they have not abandoned their plan, and so we can't take our foot off the gas on the clean electricity regulations, but I can tell you that MPs across the country in Atlantic Canada and in Toronto, every time they got out of the train station, every time they got out of their vehicle, every time they walked up to Parliament, they saw those ads and were reminded in a very visual and real way of the impacts that their policies were having on everyday Canadians. Of course, as Premier mentioned, Minister Steven Guilbeault has a pattern of making large pronouncements at international conferences. COP is coming up in less than a month, and we've been told that an oil and gas production cap is coming at the very same time. So this is the time to start looking at a campaign to explain to Canadians, and it is a tougher one, I'll be honest, how to explain how an energy production cap impacts Canadians. Well, as Premier mentioned, it does. It matters if we don't have access to safe, affordable, reliable energy. If we as a country don't have energy security, I can tell you that that was part of the discussions we were having in Washington in June of this year. That matters. But how does it matter to an everyday Canadian? Well, when you take things like a carbon tax and then you layer on a clean electricity regulation that's going to drive up the cost of their electricity bills, and then you layer on an oil and gas production cap that is going to kill tens of thousands of jobs, drive investment out of our country and lower the GDP of not only our province, but the entire country as a whole. That absolutely means less money for every Canadian household. And as the Conference Board of Canada suggested, that's over $400 less a month per family. So what does that mean? If the cost of energy is higher, it costs more to get your groceries here from where they're coming from. It costs more to heat and power your homes. This matters, and I think it matters even more so when we see the layering of all of those policies with absolutely no care, attention, recognition, I would say apologies, quite frankly, for the impact that that has on everyday people. It's all about ideology, and we needed to make it real for everyday people. So when they're sitting at home over the dinner table, they know exactly the impact that these policies are going to have on them, their neighbors, and their family, and are encouraged then to make sure that their MPs across the country, and especially where it matters, in Atlantic Canada, in the Toronto area, we hear a lot about the 905. We want those MPs to hear. So we are encouraging Canadians to have their voices heard. And I would say this, also just on the effectiveness of the Clean Electricity Tell the Feds campaign, we were first out of the gate talking about how damaging these policies would be. And then as Premier mentioned, we started to see regulators from other provinces saying, you know what, they're right about that. Then just a couple months ago, we saw Electricity Canada say, you know what, these are problematic. They are unachievable. They are unattainable. They will impact affordability of power generation. And so I think on this one as well, this matters to people in Newfoundland. It matters in Saskatchewan. It matters in BC, where natural gas, as the Premier said, is a large part of their economy as well. And so this campaign, really the thought behind it is how do you make it real for people so that they stand up and tell this federal government, who quite frankly just has this tendency to ignore the very real feedback they're hearing from Canadians, that it's time to scrap this cap. And you know, I said more intense things yesterday when I suggested maybe it's also time for an election. But I think that's what Canadians are saying, again, right across our country. But this campaign is about making it real for everyday people.
Jonathan?
Okay, my follow-up pertains to your advocacy, to Premier Smith's advocacy about opposing the oil and gas emissions cap. So we've seen you make various statements, you put out various social media posts, now we have this ad campaign, but the feds, for some reason, aren't budging on their position. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's ideology, honestly. I think that they got locked into a paradigm thinking it was achievable. They go to the international conferences and they try to outbid every other player at the table, saying that we can go stronger and harder and faster than anyone else. And they simply don't have a mandate from the people to do that, nor do they have the constitutional jurisdiction to do that. So in the lead up to the next talks happening in Baku in the next month, we want to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And look, we are prepared to take this to court if we need to. We've won on the issue of the Impact Assessment Act. We've just recently set a letter showing all of the different amendments that we think they need to make to be in compliance with the court decision. If they don't make those amendments, we'll have to go back to court again. We're in the process of fighting them on the plastics ban, which the court agreed with us was an overreach and abuse of their federal jurisdiction and unconstitutional. And so this is what we're hoping to do, is that we delay the implementation so that we can see cooler heads prevail, so that we can come to the table and come up with some kind of approach that actually is going to work for our province and not damage the country.
Thanks, Premier. We now have time for one more question. Operator, please flip through our last caller.
Your next question comes from the line of Graham Thompson with The Star. Please go ahead.
Hi, Premier, I have a question for you. Just looking at some of the comments from your ministers, from Minister Schulz, that this is a wacko policy, if I heard her correctly, that will tackle every industry and crater our economy. Basically, it's designed to undermine Alberta. But yet, back
to reconcile those two things, because on the one hand, we have now increased our ability to export our product internationally. We're about to see Coastal GasLink open up with the completion of LNG Canada. There's several other LNG export facilities on the coast. So why would you, on the one hand, make sure that we've got more egress, more ability to get our product to market, and then on the other hand come through with a policy that will result in shutting in oil and natural gas? It makes no sense. And that's what we're trying to point out is, yes, let's continue working together to get our product internationally. Let's continue to be the secure supplier of safe and affordable and clean energy to the rest of the planet, but don't keep on layering on these policies that are ultimately going to result in production cuts and hurt Canadians in the meantime. So I think they've got to reconcile that. It doesn't make any sense.
As a follow-up, you mentioned carbon capture. You've mentioned it before. Of course, you're spending a lot of money to help that out. But it seems that the Deloitte report that you've talked about, just quoting here from a Canadian press story, saying that report casts doubt on the idea that widespread deployment of carbon capture will drive down emissions from the oil and gas sector. So, yes, the report does support what you're saying on one hand, but at the same time, it seems to be undermining the idea that carbon capture is a big solution.
Well, look, that may be the case in other jurisdictions that don't have the incredible opportunity we have for pore space. But we have some of the best pore space on the planet, I think second only to Russia, in the ability for us to capture and safely store CO2. And so I would say that it is a solution for Alberta in particular, and potentially for Canada more generally speaking. That's part of the reason why we and the federal government are also investing in Dow Chemical's net zero petrochemical project, Air Products, and Heidelberg. All of those have a carbon capture component to them. So I would say that there is a huge opportunity, but it's not the only answer. Obviously, that's part of the reason why we're looking at alternative fuels to decarbonize the upstream, and why we're supporting things like direct air capture as well as other alternative fuels to be able to get there. I mean, I don't know what the mix of technologies are going to be by 2050, but what I do know is that this industry always finds a way to turn a waste stream into a revenue source. That's been the history of this industry. We now have 6,000 products that come from a barrel of oil, and this is just the latest challenge. And if we give enough time and we allow them to use their revenues to be able to fund that kind of research, I'm very confident that we'll be able to find all kinds of solutions. Carbon capture will be one part of it.
Great. Thanks, everyone. That concludes our announcement today.
Thanks, everyone.